Hey you, yes, you, the one reading this right now wondering, why does this feel like it's speaking to my soul? You didn't come here out of curiosity. You didn't stumble across this because the algorithm served it to you. You were called, and this message, this very page, is confirmation. You're not reading with your eyes only. Your spirit has been reaching out for alignment, and now heaven has answered. You've spent decades doing all the things life told you were expected, working, giving, proving, pleasing, enduring. You've played roles, worn masks, followed rules. You've survived storms that never made the news. You've buried dreams you didn't know how to explain. You've looked in the mirror some days and whispered to yourself, "There's more. I know there has to be more." And now, right here, right now, I want you to hear it with absolute clarity. There is more, and it begins at 40. Not because 40 is magical, but because 40 is biblical. It's prophetic. It's patterned all throughout Scripture. Moses spent 40 years in Egypt, 40 years in the desert, and then began his true calling at age 80, prepared through the fire of obscurity. Jesus fasted 40 days before stepping fully into his public ministry. The Israelites wandered 40 years until the old thinking died off and the promised generation could rise. Elijah walked 40 days to Mount Horeb, where he encountered God's whisper in a cave, and everything shifted. Goliath taunted Israel for 40 days, and on the 41st, a young David, carrying more faith than armor, ended the reign of fear. 40 is not delay. 40 is divine timing. 40 is transformation. 40 is release. If you've spent your earlier years misunderstood, underdeveloped, or misplaced, that wasn't punishment. It was preparation. The silence you endured wasn't a void. It was a womb. The pressure you lived under wasn't a curse. It was a crush designed to release oil. Every delay, strategic. Every heartbreak, sharpening. Every detour, directed. At 40, something ancient shifts inside the chosen. You don't wake up with new muscles. You wake up with clear memory. A memory of who you were before trauma taught you to be small. A memory of the assignment you were given before religion told you it was too much. A memory of your real name spoken in heaven before you were formed in your mother's womb. Jeremiah 1:5. This is not midlife. This is mission launch. This is not about a second wind. This is about first fire, finally igniting for real. So if you're reading this while staring at 40 like it's the beginning of the end, hear me clearly. This is not the end. This is the beginning. And now, let me tell you exactly why. For most of your life, you were taught that letting go was a sign of loss, that walking away meant failure, that release meant weakness. And so you held on. You clung to broken relationships, outgrown identities, outdated versions of yourself, titles that were too small for your soul, and friendships that only loved the version of you that stayed silent. You called it loyalty, but deep down, it was fear. Fear of being alone, fear of starting over, fear of disappointing others, fear of being misunderstood. You tolerated what drained you because you weren't sure if you had permission to choose peace. You tolerated dishonor because your heart was loyal to potential. You tolerated silence from God because you confused his stillness with absence. And yet, in every silent season, in every broken connection, in every bitter ending you never asked for, heaven was doing something holy. You weren't being punished. You were being positioned. You weren't being rejected. You were being rerouted. You weren't being discarded. You were being delivered. And it took you years, decades even, to understand this. Letting go is not defeat. Letting go is divine alignment. Jesus said in John 15:2, "Every branch in me that does not bear fruit he takes away, and every branch that does bear fruit he prunes, that it may bear more fruit. You are the branch, he is the gardener." And for years he was cutting things off of you, relationships, ideas, habits, attachments, not because you were wrong, but because he was making room for the weight of your calling. You mistook the pruning as punishment. You cried over it. You questioned your worth because of it. But now, at 40, you finally see. Those losses were strategic. Those disconnections were divine. God was not taking things from you. He was taking things off you, so that what he placed inside of you could finally grow without competition. The version of you who needed to be needed is gone. The version of you who overextended to keep the peace is gone. The version of you who asked for permission to be honest, to feel deeply, to walk away when dishonored, that version is buried. And in her place stands someone new, someone refined, someone released. You no longer chase closure from those who were never called to complete you. You no longer water roots that were never planted by God. You no longer hand access to people who mishandled your open heart. Psalm 1 says, "Blessed is the one who does not walk in step with the wicked, but whose delight is in the law of the Lord. They are like a tree planted by streams of water." Trees shed every season what no longer serves them. They do not apologize for shedding. They do not ask leaves to stay. And now neither do you. At 40, you begin to see your past with different eyes. What once felt like failure was just God saying, "This can't go with you." And that changes everything. You begin to reframe your pain, not as proof that you were too much or not enough, but as preparation for purpose. You stop labeling people who left as enemies. You begin to see them as escorts out of seasons that could have kept you stuck. You stop explaining your peace. You stop mourning closed doors. You start walking lighter, freer, surer, because now, for the first time in your life, you're not holding what God already asked you to release. And maybe the deepest shift of all is this: you no longer need to explain your letting go to anyone, because for the first time, you're not letting go with tears of confusion. You're letting go with clarity, and that clarity is a spiritual weapon. You are not trying to prove you're strong anymore. You're simply refusing to stay small. And that, chosen one, is what makes your 40s the beginning of everything. Because now your hands are finally free to carry the future God always had in mind. A future that can only be held by someone who has made peace with releasing what was never meant to last. For most of your life, time ruled you like a master. It told you when to succeed, when to marry, when to settle down, when to stop dreaming. The world handed you invisible deadlines, and you wore them like chains. At 25, you were supposed to have it figured out. At 30, you were supposed to be established. By 35, you were supposed to feel secure. But every time you tried to force your soul to move at the pace of culture, something inside you broke a little more. You started measuring yourself against calendars instead of calling. You traded divine timing for the pressure of expectation, and in the silence of your soul, you whispered, "Am I late?" But heaven was never checking your watch. Heaven was checking your readiness. Because chosen ones don't bloom early. They bloom right on time. And now, at 40, something radical has begun to shift inside you. You no longer believe the lie that you missed your moment. Because now you understand, your moment wasn't late. Your soul just wasn't ready to carry the weight yet. Ecclesiastes 3:1 says, "There is a time for everything, and a season for every activity under the heavens." And you, beloved, are finally stepping into your season. This awakening didn't come through a sermon or a podcast. It came through experience, through the ache of watching others get ahead, through the silence of unanswered prayers, through the mourning of years you thought were wasted. But what you didn't realize is that those years weren't wasted. They were invested. God was not ignoring you. He was maturing you quietly until your roots were deep enough not to break when the blessing arrived. Because when you're chosen, you're not just called to receive the promise, you're called to carry it well. And premature promotion would have crushed the you that lived by timelines. That version of you is gone now. In her place stands a soul that no longer chases the clock, but listens to Kairos, God's appointed time. In John 11, Mary and Martha sent word to Jesus, "Lord, the one you love is sick." But Jesus delayed. He stayed 2 more days. And when he finally arrived, Lazarus was already dead. But when Jesus spoke, Lazarus came out of the tomb, not just healed, but resurrected. The miracle didn't happen on their time. It happened in divine time, because Jesus never arrives late. He arrives strategically. That's what your life has been, not off track. Just strategically time for something deeper than you could have imagined. At 40, you begin to understand that your pace is not dictated by peers. It is orchestrated by purpose. The anxiety that used to plague you begins to break off, because you now see you didn't miss the opportunity. You were being made into the version of yourself who could finally hold it. And now, the pressure to compete vanishes. You stop hustling to catch up and start walking with reverence. You stop asking, "Why so late?" and start saying, "Thank you, Lord, that I wasn't released until I was truly ready." Psalm 90:12 says, "Teach us to number our days, that we may gain a heart of wisdom." You no longer measure days by accomplishments. You measure them by alignment. You no longer fear getting older. You honor it, because every year has carved something sacred into your character. You stop praying, "Lord, hurry up," and begin praying, "Lord, don't release me until you've finished your work in me." Because what you carry now cannot be rushed. You are no longer on man's timeline. You are moving by divine cadence. The world may still shout, "You're behind," but your spirit knows better. Because when God is the one writing your story, delay isn't denial, it's design. The illusion of time has lost its grip. You no longer run, you no longer flinch. You move in rhythm with the one who called you. And in that rhythm, there is peace, purpose, and power. This is the gift of 40. You stop chasing. You start receiving. You tried to find it in titles. You tried to chase it through promotions. You thought it would come when people finally recognized you, when your work got the praise it deserved, or when your life looked more together. But purpose, real purpose, never showed up in applause. It never lived in positions or achievements. That's why, for years, you kept asking, "What am I even here for?" Not because you lacked direction, but because your soul was searching for something that couldn't be handed to you by anyone else. It had to be revealed. In your 20s, purpose felt like passion. In your 30s, it felt like pressure. But now, in your 40s, it feels like clarity. Because finally, after years of pain, wandering, false starts, and deep questions, things are beginning to make sense. What once looked like chaos now looks like choreography. What once felt like rejection now feels like redirection. What once broke you now reveals where your oil was born, and you begin to see, not with your eyes, but with spiritual hindsight. Everything had purpose. Every delay, every door slammed, every person who walked away, every failure that felt final. None of it was wasted. All of it was weaving together the weight of who you are becoming. Romans 8:28 says, "And we know that in all things God works for the good of those who love him, who have been called according to his purpose." At 40, this no longer feels like a comforting verse. It feels like a personal revelation, because the proof is all over your life. The loss made you deeper. The pain made you precise. The waiting gave you wisdom. And now, you no longer need every piece to be perfect to move forward, because you finally understand that God was writing a story bigger than your comfort. And here's the secret. Purpose doesn't usually appear with a loud bang. It whispers. It draws near in the places you stop trying to prove yourself. It unfolds in the rooms where you no longer strive, where you start showing up as your whole self. No mask, no pressure, just presence. And suddenly you start seeing the pattern. You realize that what made you weird was always what made you worthy. What made you different was never a defect. It was your divine distinction. Ephesians 2:10 says, "For we are God's workmanship, created in Christ Jesus to do good works, which God prepared in advance for us to do." That means your calling isn't something you earn, it's something heaven pre-wrote. And now the layers of your past are no longer heavy, they are holy. You no longer envy someone else's lane, you honor your own. You no longer chase impact, you become it, because you finally see you were not born to replicate success. You were born to release something the earth hasn't seen yet. At 40, your internal GPS gets reactivated, but this time it's not telling you where to go, it's telling you who you've always been. And when you step into that alignment, your actions become lighter, your decisions become clearer, your boundaries become sacred, because you're no longer hustling for meaning, you're living from it. And yes, people may say, it took you long enough. But what they don't see is that diamonds take longer to form than plastic. That while others sprinted ahead, you were being built in silence. That your delay was not disobedience, it was deep construction. And now, you're not emerging with noise, you're emerging with knowing. You are no longer lost. You are no longer asking, "Who am I?" You now carry the answer in your posture, in your presence, in your discernment. You are here to disrupt patterns, restore order, bring healing, release truth and carry light. You are not just finding your purpose, you are finally becoming it. There was a time when your worth felt like a mirror, shattered by the opinions of others, fragile under the weight of disapproval. You lived for the smile of affirmation, feared the silence of rejection, and adjusted your light to fit in spaces that were too dim to hold your truth. You wanted to be liked, so you softened your voice. You wanted to be accepted, so you watered down your fire. You wanted to be seen, so you became whoever they needed you to be, until one day you realized you no longer recognized the reflection looking back at you, because it wasn't you. It was survival. It was performance. It was a mask stitched together by fear. But at 40, something sacred happens. You stop auditioning. You stop editing. You stop waiting for someone else to stamp you with approval, because you finally understand you were never sent here to be understood. You were sent here to be anointed. Galatians 1:10 says, "Am I now trying to win the approval of human beings or of God? If I was still trying to please people, I would not be a servant of Christ." And that truth cuts deep now, because you see how many years you spent confusing pleasing people with following purpose. You once thought validation would bring peace. but it never did. The applause was loud, but short-lived. The likes never lasted. The approval you craved from family members who didn't understand your path, it never truly satisfied. And now you know why, because you were trying to feed a spiritual hunger with social attention. But your calling was never meant to be measured in external metrics. Your identity was never designed to be defined by another person's perception. Jesus, the most validated being in heaven, walked this earth misunderstood, misquoted, misrepresented. In Luke 4, after reading the scroll in the synagogue and revealing his divine assignment, the crowd marveled, then tried to push him off a cliff. They loved him until he told the truth. And that's what you've learned too. Not everyone who claps is safe, and not everyone who criticizes is your enemy. True validation comes from alignment with heaven, not from applause on earth. Now at 40, you walk into rooms without shrinking. You speak without disclaimers. You make decisions not based on approval, but based on assignment. You no longer need to post your growth to prove it's real. You no longer need to explain why you've changed. You no longer apologize for what your discernment sees, because your confidence is no longer rooted in being liked. It's rooted in being led. Isaiah 2:22 says, "Stop trusting in mere humans who have but a breath in their nostrils. Why hold them in esteem? It's not arrogance. It's awareness. You've outgrown environments that required you to dilute your truth. You've released relationships that were only sustainable as long as you stayed small. And you've found a freedom that can't be bought, the freedom of being fully yourself, even if no one claps. The old you would have explained, softened, defended, begged, but not anymore. You no longer live for validation. You live from conviction. From the still, powerful knowing that you were called, approved, equipped, and sent by the only voice that matters. And once you know that, truly know that, you become unshakable. So now when someone misunderstands you, you bless them. When they reject you, you release them. When they criticize your choices, you stay silent. Because the mission no longer runs on mass approval, it runs on divine assurance. And you, chosen one, have finally stepped into the kind of power that doesn't need to be praised to stay on fire. You've stopped living to be seen. Now you live because you've been sent. It used to come in whispers, subtle nudges, quiet questions in the night. The ache in your soul that no success could silence, the moments of unexplainable stillness where your heart knew there was more, even if your mind couldn't define it. That was the beginning of your awakening. It didn't come through sermons or scriptures alone. It came through lived contradiction, seasons where what you were taught didn't match what you were experiencing. Times when everything outside said you should be happy, but your spirit remained restless. You didn't know then, but God wasn't letting you settle. He was awakening something ancient within you, not a religion, but a remnant identity. And now at 40, it no longer flickers, it burns. Your spiritual awakening has intensified. You're no longer simply curious about the supernatural. You recognize it in everything. You see God's fingerprints not just in blessings, but in burdens. You see that unanswered prayers were actually divine protection. That delay was discipleship. That silence was sacred space, not absence. Your discernment has sharpened. Where once you needed confirmation, now you only need peace. Where once you needed loud signs, now you obey the whisper. That's because you're no longer following from the outside in. You've begun to walk from the inside out. Proverbs 20:27 says, "The spirit of man is the lamp of the Lord, searching all his innermost parts." That light in you is no longer dim. It has become a beacon, not just for you, but for others who have lost their way. The things that used to entertain you don't satisfy anymore. The distractions that once worked can no longer dull your inner knowing. Your taste has changed. Your sensitivity has increased, and your appetite for spiritual depth has become insatiable. You're not just chasing answers, you're cultivating presence. You no longer seek prophecy as validation because you've begun to hear God for yourself. And that voice, the one you once doubted, has become your compass. John 10:27 says, "My sheep listen to my voice. I know them, and they follow me." You now recognize when it's him. You know the difference between anxiety and warning, between fear and conviction. And in a world drowning in noise, that clarity is your anchor. You've also realized that spirituality is not a performance. It's not how often you post scripture. It's not about your public image. It's about your private fire. You've stopped comparing your walk to others. You no longer feel guilty for leaving behind spiritual environments that grew stale, because you now understand true awakening means the altar goes with you. You are the sanctuary. You are the temple. 1 Corinthians 3:16 confirms it. Don't you know that you yourselves are God's temple and that God's Spirit dwells in your midst? That revelation changes everything. You no longer enter rooms looking to feel something. You enter knowing you carry something. And yes, you've become more sensitive to energy, to intentions, to what's unspoken. That's not weakness. That's spiritual intelligence. You are now aware of battles others cannot name. You are now alert to atmospheres others ignore. You don't just sense surface, you read soul. And that's not paranoia. That's prophetic discernment in action. Isaiah 11:2 speaks of the Spirit of the Lord resting on someone, the Spirit of wisdom and understanding, the Spirit of counsel and might, the Spirit of knowledge and the fear of the Lord. You used to think that was just for special people. Now you realize that Spirit is resting on you. You no longer chase identity through activity. You simply sit and know. You light candles not to impress, but to align. You speak less and see more. You observe patterns. You recognize spiritual warfare hiding in emotional triggers. And instead of reacting, you now retreat into stillness. Because you've learned, warfare doesn't win when you yell. It loses when you stay rooted. Ephesians 6:13 tells you, having done all, stand. That's what you do now. You stand, not always loud, but unwavering, not always perfect, but aware. This is what awakening looks like after 40. Not the flash, not the hype, but the holy inner shift where you no longer need proof, because presence is enough. You walk differently now, not because of ego, but because heaven has reintroduced you to yourself. You used to give your energy away to everything, to arguments that led nowhere, to conversations that drained you, to situations you had no business staying in. You used to scatter your presence, stretching yourself thin to meet others' expectations, to maintain false peace, to be available even when it cost you your soul. You mistook urgency for importance. You mistook loud for necessary, and you called it love, but it was self-abandonment. You called it being strong, but it was emotional exhaustion. But at 40, something changes. You no longer move from habit. You move from intention. You no longer pour your energy into proving anything. Now you reserve it for purpose, because your energy has become powerful. not in a new age, trendy way, but in a sacred, spiritual way. A way that makes people pause when you walk into a room. A way that shifts conversations without you having to raise your voice. A way that silences confusion just by your stillness. That kind of energy doesn't come from self-help. It comes from heaven-formed inner order. Proverbs 4:23 says, "Above all else, guard your heart, for everything you do flows from it." And you've learned how to guard it, not with walls, but with wisdom. You no longer feel guilty for saying no. You no longer apologize for choosing silence, because you've discovered that your energy is not infinite, and what you carry now is too sacred to be wasted. Where you used to chase connection, you now attract alignment. People come to you not because you're performing, but because your presence is anchored. Because your words don't scatter, they land. Because your gaze is discerning. Because your soul is no longer desperate, it's rooted. And that rootedness produces something the world cannot replicate: vibrational authority. 1 Peter 5:10 says, "And the God of all grace, after you have suffered a little while, will himself restore you and make you strong, firm and steadfast." That's who you are now: strong, firm, steadfast. Not because you shouted your way there, but because you stopped leaking power through people-pleasing, overgiving and under-prioritizing yourself. You feel environments more than you used to, not because you're sensitive, but because your spirit is finally tuned in. You know when something's off. You discern when something's draining. And instead of excusing it, you now trust what your spirit senses. Because you've learned that discernment is not paranoia, it's spiritual intelligence. Hebrews 5:14 says, "But solid food is for the mature, who by constant use have trained themselves to distinguish good from evil." That training didn't happen overnight. It happened in every betrayal you endured, every room that felt off, every friendship you outgrew but didn't understand at the time. All of it sharpened your knowing, and now your knowing is your defense. Your energy has boundaries now, and those boundaries are not bitterness, they are protection of assignment. You no longer entertain gossip because it's beneath your vibration. You no longer carry what isn't yours because it disrupts your alignment. You no longer stay in circles that keep shrinking your vision because you've finally remembered you were born to expand the kingdom, not manage someone else's comfort. Isaiah 54:2 says, "Enlarge the place of your tent, do not hold back." And you don't hold back anymore. Not your truth, not your power, not your light. You now understand your energy doesn't just enter rooms, it reshapes them. You don't need to try hard to be powerful. You are. You don't need to convince anyone, you just need to stay connected. Because when your soul is anchored, your energy becomes a weapon, a healing balm, a prophetic signal, a confirmation that God still moves through people who've been broken, rebuilt, and reborn. So no, you're not too quiet now. You're just no longer leaking. You're not distant. You're discerning. You're not cold. You're consecrated. And the power you walk in now is not from charisma. It's from clarity. You don't shake rooms by effort anymore. You shake them by essence. There was a time when silence felt like punishment. When being alone meant something was wrong. With you, with your life, with your worth. You filled every moment with noise, phone calls, meetings, people, even prayer that sounded more like pleading than presence. Because underneath it all was a fear. What if no one shows up? What if no one chooses me? What if this silence never ends? And so you learn to avoid solitude, not because it was bad, but because you hadn't yet learned to meet yourself in it. But now, something has shifted. You no longer fear the quiet. You seek it. You protect it. You honor it like a sacred sanctuary, because you finally understand. Solitude is not loneliness. Solitude is where heaven speaks the loudest. Luke 5:16 says, "But Jesus often withdrew to lonely places and prayed." Jesus, the Son of God, fully divine, fully man, intentionally pulled away from the crowd, not because he was overwhelmed, but because he understood that clarity doesn't come from the crowd, it comes from the cave. And that's where you've been too. The cave seasons, the nights when no one called, the years when it seemed like the world moved on without you. You didn't know it then, but God wasn't ignoring you. He was calling you closer. He was breaking your addiction to external noise so that he could reintroduce you to the deeper voice within. At 40, solitude is no longer a threat. It's a tool, a healing space, a place where your soul catches up to your assignment. You don't feel the need to explain why you're unavailable. You no longer rush back into the crowd when the silence gets thick, because now you recognize what's born in silence cannot be stolen in noise. Psalm 46:10 says, "Be still and know that I am God." Not be busy, not be productive, not be loud, be still. That stillness used to terrify you, now it strengthens you, because in that stillness you've discovered that you're not alone. You're anchored, surrounded by a presence that requires no explanation, held by a Father who whispers louder than the world shouts, led by a Spirit who doesn't need to prove anything. He just is. And maybe the most healing part of all is this: you've stopped interpreting solitude as rejection. You've stopped assuming that being alone means being unloved. You now know you were not being abandoned, you were being set apart. Mark 6:31 tells us Jesus said to his disciples, "Come with me by yourselves to a quiet place and get some rest." You now understand that rest is not found in doing nothing. Rest is found in intentional withdrawal to reconnect with what truly matters. Solitude has become sacred to you. You light candles not for romance, but for reverence. You sit in stillness not because you're bored, but because you're becoming. In the silence, you journal prayers that turn into revelation. In the silence, you grieve versions of yourself that no longer fit. In the silence, you remember who you are, not who the world told you to be. And yes, some people may misread your silence. They'll say you've changed, that you're distant, that you've disconnected. But the truth is, you've simply become too full to keep living empty. You no longer chase company to avoid confrontation with yourself. You no longer fear being unseen, because you now carry a knowing. What heaven sees is enough. What's built in private carries weight in public, and what's protected in solitude shines without striving. So now, you don't fear being alone, because you're never truly alone. You've learned to sit at the table with your soul and with God and call it holy ground. You've embraced solitude, not as an escape, but as an encounter. So now, here you are, standing at the threshold not of a new decade, but of your true destiny. You've walked through 8 layers of spiritual refinement, 8 veils torn, 8 locked doors opened, not outward, but inward. And now, everything that used to confuse you makes sense. The silence, the delays, the wounds, the wilderness, the people who left, the dreams that seemed to die, the years you thought were wasted, none of it was random. All of it was rehearsal, and not just for survival, but for release. You now know what you couldn't have known at 25, what was still blurry at 35, but at 40, clarity comes. You've mastered the art of letting go, not out of loss, but out of reverence for what's ahead. You've stopped letting time control you, because now you walk in divine cadence, not cultural pressure. You've discovered your true purpose, not a title or a career, but a calling etched in your bones. You've released the need for validation because you no longer need to be approved by the world you were sent to disrupt. Your spiritual awareness is no longer a seed, it's a garden. You've stepped into energy that isn't about charisma, but about kingdom clarity. You've embraced solitude and finally found the sound of your own soul. And most of all, you've made the shift, the sacred, irreversible shift, where you no longer live for survival or for someone else's expectations. You live for yourself, for God, for alignment, for your assignment. Now you don't just walk, you walk in weight. You carry spiritual authority because you've been crushed enough to walk in compassion. You've been refined enough to carry responsibility. You don't shout anymore because your silence shakes. You don't chase applause because your presence speaks louder than validation ever could. This is not a reinvention. This is a reclamation. This is not starting over. This is stepping in, finally, boldly, clearly, into the identity heaven wrote for you before the world tried to edit it. And to every lie that told you you were late, you now say, "No, I am right on time." To every voice that said you were too much, you now say, "This is exactly who God made me to be." To every cycle that tried to shrink you, you now say, "I was never meant to fit. I was born to stretch the system." So breathe deep, chosen one, because from this moment forward, you no longer walk as the version of yourself shaped by pain. You walk as the version refined by purpose. The fire you carry now cannot be extinguished. The light you move in now cannot be dimmed. The path before you now cannot be closed, because God opened it and no man can shut it. Revelation 3:8. This is your time, this is your release, this is your rebirth, this is your true beginning. You are no longer becoming, you are here. If this message has spoken to your soul, declare it now. I am chosen, I am ready, I am stepping into the life I was born for. And don't keep this revelation to yourself. Send it to someone turning 40. Send it to a warrior who forgot they were still dangerous. Send it to a soul who's been quiet for too long. Your freedom is their permission. This is not the end of your story. This is the beginning of your legacy. You are God's chosen, and the world is about to remember what heaven never forgot.